Good morning, and welcome to the Museum of the San Ramon Valley's third Thursday virtual speaker series. I am Dan Dunn, the director of the museum. Today is the 10th presentation in this series. Past presentations have included the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment, California's first people, then and now, and the Alamo Pioneer Cemetery. Last month, the presentation was the history and future of the Sunol Water Temple. Our presentation today is entitled Camp Parks, When War and National Security Came to the San Ramon and Amador Valleys. You've met our presenter before today. Steve Minniear was the presenter for our first program last spring on Highway 21, and we're very happy to have him back. Steve is the historian for the city of Dublin and past president of the Dublin Historical Preservation Association. He's the author of several web pages on Camp Parks, Camp Shoemaker, and Parks Air Force Base, and others. He's also the author of Dublin, California, A Brief History. Shameless plug for the museum store. It's a splendid volume, and you can pick it up now that we're reopening tomorrow in our museum store. So we hope you come by and grab that. Please use the chat window at the bottom of the screen for any questions that you have. Feel free to send in questions at any time during the presentation, and we'll address them at the end. And now to our presentation. It's my great pleasure to welcome back Steve Minniear. Steve, I understand that the camp parks that we see today is only a small part of the camp parks of the 1940s.
Yes, you're quite right. Camp Parks was much larger. It seems recently it keeps on getting smaller, and that is just a sign of the times. So let me get this going for you. And here we are. And here I am. Thank you again for having me back. I'm happy to talk to you about Camp Parks, and I hope that we won't bore you too much. But we'll start the conversation, so to speak, with a little description of what we're talking about. So we're talking about a part of Dublin. As you can see in the upper left-hand corner, the little arrow is pointing to basically what is now central Dublin. Camp Parks, in its long history, going back to about 1942, was in a huge area. It was basically about 5 square miles with the other bases nearby. In the lower map down here, Dan alluded to the fact that Camp Parks is getting smaller, but between Doherty Road and Arnold Road is what most of us have considered Camp Parks for the longest time. It goes up into Contra Costa County and goes all the way down to 580. Recently, it has been getting cut back since about the 70s or 80s, first for BART and some commercial areas, and now for some residential areas. But if you look on the right here, you're going to see a map that's much, much different than we're used to seeing. And what you will see is what Dublin and Pleasanton and Livermore looked like around 1940. It was primarily farmland. And as you can see in the picture behind me, it was pretty empty. What you see behind me is a picture of Camp Parks a little bit later. But in 1940, you could come down off of the hill from Hayward on your way to Turlock or Stockton and see nothing but brown grass most of the year and some cows as you drove along what was then Highway 50. It's Highway 50 back then, a 2-lane road, is basically the same as Highway 580. And you would have come to the crossroads town of Dublin, which was an agricultural area. And then you would go on your merry way out to the east. In 1941, at the start of World War II, the US Navy and the US government realized that they had a war to fight in the Pacific and that they needed to move men and material and supplies and other things, not only from the East Coast to the West Coast, but from the West Coast out to the Pacific to prosecute the war. So there began a huge amount of land purchasing by the US government in 1942 to build the bases that were going to be necessary to prosecute the war in the Pacific. And one of the reasons that they came out to Dublin was because there's really nothing out there in Dublin at that time. It's primarily small farms, a few large farms. There's the highway. There's this thing called the railroad, which we know of today as the Iron Horse Rail Trail. So the Navy buys up 5.2 square miles, and they decide to put a base out there, or out here. And the base comes to us in part for a brand new aspect of the US Navy, which is called the Seabees. And the Seabees are a cute name for the initials construction battalions. And they are groups of men that are pretty much hired directly from the economy. Remember in 1941, 42 even, the US employment was pretty poor. Not a lot of people still didn't have jobs. It was the end of the Depression. So the US Navy decides we can fight a war in the Pacific, but we're gonna have to build bases and harbors and many, many other things. How do we do that? And they came up with the idea of hiring the people who already had the skills, giving them a little bit of training on how to be in the Navy, and they will build basically construction battalion, construction groups of about 1,000 men. And they can build anything, anywhere. Their motto was can do. Give them the supplies, get them there, and they will do it. Which means that you have to train these people. You have to have a place for them to learn their trades and get organized. And that's going to be Camp Parks. In the lower right-hand corner, you can see an emblem from about 1945 that they would have worn on the uniform, talking about Camp Parks, Rest and Recuperation Center, which is what they called it. And this is a front page article from the PG&E newsletter in May 1943, talking about this huge base that was getting built out near Dublin. The other interesting thing about the Seabees, unlike the rest of the military, is that these are people with skills already have, and they're much older. They tend to be 20s and the 30s, 40s, 50s. There's even stories of 60-year-old guys enlisting in the Seabees to be able to do their part for the war. And so why do they build out here? They build out here in Dublin because Dublin has good roads, this Highway 50, east and west. It has a good road north and south, which we called Highway 21 back in the day. And it also had a rail line, and the railroad was active at that point. So they could actually bring troops out on rail cars and also move freight and material back and forth. And also, one of the little stories is why did you build Camp Parks out there in the middle of nowhere was that in the event that the Japanese sailed into San Francisco Bay, their battleships would not be able to attack the Navy base outside of Dublin. I think that has got to be one of the least plausible reasons to build out here. It had much, much more to do with cheap land, flat land, and easy to construct activities. On the left here, you see one of the things that they built. This was the iconic Camp Park sign that still exists today. It's one of the last things left over from World War II. And here you see two Navy Seabee shore patrolmen guarding the front gate of Camp Parks. What did Camp Parks look like? Well, basically on the right here, we have an aerial projection, aerial picture of Highway 50, which we now know as 580. And over here is Doherty Road. And over here is the road that eventually becomes known as Arnold Road. And this is what traditionally we've thought about as Camp Parks. But right next door to this base where there were 30,000 sailors, there was another base. And this is basically from Arnold Road over to Tossahara Creek. That was Camp Shoemaker. It was another Navy base with 30,000 sailors. And this was where you would go once you had enlisted and got your basic training from any place in the US. They would ship you out to Camp Shoemaker to wait for your assignment in the Pacific. If you knew anyone who served in the Pacific, there's a very good chance that they first came in their Navy service to Camp Shoemaker, waiting for their time to be assigned to ships and to being shipped out of San Francisco. And finally, over here between Tassajara Creek and Tassajara Road was a 1,000 bed hospital that was built to take care of all these folks over here. Toward the end of the war, it was improved to 3,000 beds, but basically it had about another 10,000 people. And over here on the left, you can see basically the same schematic. One of the odd things about building Camp Parks was it's literally the middle of nowhere back then. So they were trying to figure out, what do we call it? You know, what is this place? Well, is it Dublin? Well, Dublin is too small. It's only got about 200 people. Do we say that Camp Parks is near Pleasanton, a huge town of maybe 1,500 people? Or do we even call it Livermore, which had about 2,500 people? So when you look at documents in the past, you will find different places where Camp Parks is. Sometimes it's called Pleasanton. Originally, it was said it was in Livermore, and then we all think of it nowadays as having really been in Dublin. And this is how they got there. This is, in fact, a group of Seabees arriving on the rail. Oops, sorry, things are going too fast. These are riding on that's the Iron Horse Trail, basically near Dublin Boulevard. This is from the newspapers in about 1944. And on the right, once they all got off the train, they had their own little band, and they would march off to where they were going to be housed in redwood two-story barracks. Literally hundreds of two-story barracks. To house 30,000 people, you need a lot of barracks, a lot of Quonset huts, and they all lived there. These were open bays, probably 30 or 40 to half of a floor, or maybe more, depending on how many sailors were around and needed to be housed. So Seabees not only just learned their trade and learned to get organized, but that they also went out and had fun, as you'll see here on the right. These are period postcards of a bunch of Seabees getting ready to go have fun. They would leave the main gate or a gate on Highway 50, and the first thing they would do would be hitchhike on Highway 50 to go any place other than where they were, because there was nothing to do out here. Pleasanton and Livermore had minimal recreation activities that would be of interest to people that were primarily out to get drunk and have a good time. They would go to Hayward. Sometimes there would be buses that left regularly from the Navy. Sometimes they would be picked up by people, patriotic people driving along Highway 50. Go to Hayward, catch a train to Oakland. By that I mean a streetcar. And then from there, either go stay in Oakland or go off to San Francisco. So on the lower right indicates that there were some opportunities to have some fun at Camp Parks. 30,000 guys want to have some fun. So they worked with the communities, and the local communities tried to have some opportunities. So they would ask all the girls at Amador High to be a hostess and come out and go dancing, provide some safe and chaste recreation for all the sailors. There is a story from Pleasanton that suggests that when the girls from Amador High were invited to go do their patriotic duty and dance with sailors, they said, okay, we'll do it. But they were told that, oh, by the way, the first place you're going to go this weekend is going to be Camp Parks. And the story is none of the girls were interested in dancing with 30, 40, and 50-year-old guys who were construction guys. They would rather go to Camp Shoemaker and dance with the 18 and 20-year-old cute guys. We don't know if that's a true story or not, but that's what we've heard. In the middle here at the bottom is a picture from one of the parties at Camp Parks. I like to think that when I look at that tub of drink down here being served to everybody, that these people being Seabees who have a lot of life experience and a lot of skills would not have let that punch be unalcoholic for very long. And sometimes that's why I think that this woman in here has already had several punches and she's feeling pretty happy. On the left here, we've got the barracks. These were temporary barracks. They were always designed to be there for the duration, just like many of the sailors and Seabees at Camp Parks. They were only going to be there for the war. They were there to do a job and leave. And one of the few buildings to last for a long time after the war was this one down here. So if you had kids and they were learning to play basketball in the 80s, you might have come here. They might have played basketball in this huge recreation drill hall. It's called the drill hall back in the day. Had about 7 or 8 basketball courts inside. And it was one of the few buildings to remain after the war. And there are stories, in fact, that at a later date when Camp Parks became another facility, this was where George Foreman trained while he was in the Job Corps. So just to remind you that it's not just a place, it's a bunch of people. And people have, very interesting stories, and they all led very different lives. This is one of them. This is Oscar Schnevice, who, yes, if you know any German, his name really means and translates to Oscar Snow White. Oscar came from Brooklyn, New York, along with, 7 or 8 of his siblings and cousins who joined the other services who served all around the world. But Oscar came out. He was an artist. He was well known back in his Brooklyn community for being a painter. And while he was out at Camp Parks waiting to get deployed out to the Pacific with other Seabees, he took the time to do these drawings, which wound up in the local Camp Parks newspaper, the Camp Parks log. And on the right here, you see Seabees doing what Seabees do, which is constructing something at the base. Oscar was in the 123rd Battalion and eventually was transferred out to Hawaii with his whole battalion. This picture here on the left, I think, is really interesting because while it shows a bunch of Seabees probably not playing volleyball in any particular set of rules that we know, if you look in the background here, the artist Oscar has done a very interesting thing. Your eye is drawn to where the volleyball is and looking above all the people trying to play and maybe just push each other around. But on the distance, in the distance, on the horizon, is this little hill. If you've ever driven from, say, Dublin to Hayward and gone up 580 and gone west, you would have seen this hill, which is Donlin Point. And so I just think it's kind of fun that he incorporated one of the few landmarks in Dublin's landscape into this picture of a bunch of Seabees having fun. So you may wonder, who was Parks? Why did they name this place after someone, and who was that someone? And that's the person. That's Rear Admiral Charles W. Parks. And there's a bunch of information about him. They picked him in part because he was an engineer. He led the Navy in the construction of docks and yards and facilities during World War I that allowed the US to move troops from the East Coast onto France and eventually Germany. Without his leadership, it would have been much, much more difficult and much, much longer to move troops and get the war done and get the US contribution to the World War I Allied activities possible. So when the Navy is building literally hundreds of bases all over the country, they have the convention of naming them after previous Navy personnel. And so they actually had to go pretty far down in their history to find some of these folks, including Shoemaker, who was a Rear Admiral, but also Charles W. Parks. So let's see, my computer is being very difficult today. So dances, yes, they had dances at the site. This picture, these two pictures are here for a very particular purpose, to remind you that they had big bands that would come and perform. And these are headliners from all over America would do their patriotic bit to come to the bases and provide entertainment. Somewhere in here, Over here are probably some high school girls from Amador High and maybe even Livermore High that have been coming to do their hostess duty. The other thing, though, is it's important to realize that Camp Parks, like much of America, was a segregated place. African Americans were not allowed to mix freely, even in California. So the Navy was a very segregated service. So there were many African Americans who served in the CDs at Camp Parks, and they probably were segregated by unit, because at that time there were African American units and then there were white units. So this on the right indicates that there were African Americans at Camp Parks. We don't know how segregated the Camp Parks was, but we know that in this example, the entertainment was. But big, well-known African American musicians and bands would come to Camp Parks and also provide entertainment for all the troops. And not only is there music and live bands, there's also theater, many, many movies. In fact, many movies would open at the bases around the US and be transferred and shown to the bases. And there were at Camp Parks, 2 huge theaters that would seat 300 to 400 people each time. And they would play probably 5 or 6 or 7 showings a day. 30,000 people can only train so much. They can only use the training facilities so much and only use the mess facilities so much. And then they would have opportunities. And not everybody could get off base. Not everybody would get liberty. There were also religious services offered at Camp Parks and all Navy bases throughout the US. Up on the upper right here is Mcgann Chapel, which is a very, very unique, probably one of the most unique constructed chapels in the Navy. And it was done by someone who had volunteered to be in the Navy, a CB. He had been a well-known architect back in the Midwest, decided he wanted to do his part. He enlisted, he was a chief petty officer. But one of his responsibilities in 1944 was to redesign and rebuild many of the existing facilities and upgrade them and make it a little bit more pleasant to be at Camp Parks. And this particular Mcgann Chapel still exists today. It was taken down at the end of 1946 and moved to San Lorenzo, and it is now the San Lorenzo Community Church. So it's nice that it's, still around here. The war ends in 1945. The picture here that you see was taken by a CB on a ship coming back from the Pacific on his way to Camp Parks. And this is just before he goes under the Golden Gate Bridge into San Francisco. On the right, upper right, you will see that Camp Parks closed, like most Navy facilities closed. They didn't close right at the end of the war. It took time to process people out. Camp Parks closed in 1946, but the Navy didn't go away. The Navy stayed and took over Camp Parks and made it part of Camp Shoemaker. And that Camp Shoemaker, those combined bases, basically were processing out about 1,000 sailors a day throughout the end of 1945 and much of 1946. So while Camp Parks kind of becomes Camp Shoemaker, it gets to come back in a different way in the 1950s. By 1946, 1947, even the Navy is done with all this property that basically goes from Doherty Road all the way over to Tassajara Road, and it stands empty for a while. Alameda County decides, hey, can you give us the old jail that you had at the Navy base? And that becomes the original Santa Rita jail over here. This is Highway 50, by the way. There's a brand new armed service in 1947, the US Air Force. And the US Air Force has to build everything up from scratch. And they need a place to train new recruits for the Air Force. And they start a number of bases throughout the US. And one of the bases they decide is going to be at the centrally located area right near Dublin. And they're going to take it over from the Navy. They're going to rebuild it because most of the buildings had been sold to private parties and taken down. And this now becomes Parks Air Force Base. And Parks Air Force Base lasts from about 52 to 59. About 30 or 40 50,000 people go through it. On any given day, it's probably about 10 or 15,000 from 52 to 59. Most of them doing their basic recruit activities. And the facilities are upgraded to a little bit. I like the mess hall down here in the lower left, excuse me. It seems to be pretty nice and a little bit better than the old Navy World War II ones. As you can see in the upper left-hand corner, they decided to keep the sign. So one of the things that the Air Force does when they take over the base is decide, well, this is not Navy. We don't want anybody to think it's Navy. So we're going to take down the part of the sign that says camp, because after all, this is the Air Force. So it's an Air Force base. So it becomes Parks Air Force Base. And it processes literally tens of thousands of recruits while it's open. And for a very short time after the Korean War, it's Camp Parks, or Parks Air Force Base, excuse me, still is the place where you go in the Air Force to wait to get assigned overseas to go to Japan or go to Korea or go to any number of places. So it becomes a transit point yet again, this time for the Air Force. Oddly enough, when you look at Camp Parks nowadays, or Parks Reserve Forces training area, and you happen to go into a building called 311 and look up in the ceiling, you're going to find remnants of Parks Air Force Base days. We don't know why someone from Parks Air Force Base put paintings up on the ceiling beams. We don't know why he did it. We don't know how he did it. And we don't know how he possibly had enough time to do all these drawings, because they're all over this building 311, which may have been the mess hall back in the day. But he decided that he was going to do his part to document what it was like to be in the Air Force during Parks Air Force Base days. So this is what most of the recruits were doing, learning how to march, probably not too well based on what we see up here. They had lots of KP duty, and then they also got to eat the great food that the Air Force was offering in that wonderful mess hall that you just saw. Many people who had been in World War II left their various services, Army, Navy, but when the new Air Force came in, some of them decided, hey, maybe I'll go back in the service, and that I've got experience. They'll give me rapid promotions and make me a sergeant. Well, as you can see, sometimes that appears not to have worked out. But again, I guess some of them did get their promotions because they were all excited about getting more pay. Up here on the right, you're going to see the barracks that had been built by the Air Force. And this is, in fact, Parks Air Force Base around 1955. And one of the happy recruits, and I'm going to say he's happy because he must be done with basic training. Down here is one last painting that we found up on the ceiling, so to speak, of this aircraft. And we were all wondering, why would you pick that particular aircraft, FA-356, and paint it? What did it mean to whoever painted this? And it turns out that all we could figure out is this plane, FA-356, was a trainer that was used at Lackland Air Force Base. And it eventually went on the static display right outside the main gate. So maybe this guy was at Lackland Air Force Base for a while. We probably will never know. Parks stops being an Air Force base in 1959 as the Air Force consolidates all its activities back into smaller facilities more central to the U.S., for example, Lackland Air Force Base. In 1965, there's a brand new group of people that want to use Parks, and they want to use the somewhat run down, because by this point it's almost 5 or 6 years since anybody's been using these barracks over here. So the Department of Labor institutes a new program where there's going to be residential vocational training for young adults, not even young adults, they're basically kids. We're talking about sometimes 15 and 16 and 17 and 18-year-old kids from inner cities all across the US who are invited to come to various Job Corps centers around the country and learn trades, learn things like how to operate and how to repair typewriters. and how to operate and repair vehicles. And this program has about 5,000 or 6,000 young kids, all at this Department of Labor facility, all their first time away from home, all away from many of them were from inner cities across the US to get this new set of skills that they thought would be helpful for occupations in the future, brought to this very strange place in the middle of nowhere, California, which was the Barracks Job Corps Center. Many of the local communities were not particularly happy to have inner city kids. It was not probably our best hour of inclusivity. But it all ends in 1969 when the program is shut down very, very quickly by a new administration. And the picture on the right here is supposedly the last Job Corps kid looking fondly. I won't say that they had a great experience here sometimes because the barracks were pretty rough by that point, on his way back to his home. And then the Army comes. The Army takes over around 1967 and starts using the facility for their own training for the reserve forces. And what we know of today as Camp Parks is all about the Army and the Army's base there. And for a long time, there was a huge issue with the infrastructure was all left over. All the buildings were left over from the Air Force days, and they weren't in very good shape. But glad to say that many of the new buildings are coming up, and it's much more easy and pleasant for people doing their reserve training, sometimes on weekends, sometimes for several weeks during the year. Most often, reserve training takes place during the summer where whole units will come to Camp Parks. And we're happy to say that one of the new buildings that got built at Camp Parks is the Dublin Camp Parks Military History Center. It is open to the public, basically from noon to 4 or 5. It's right outside the main gate. So when you drive into the new main gate off of Doherty, there will be a building. And in the back of the building is this new history center where we tell the whole history of Camp Parks and Camp Shoemaker and the city of Dublin and the impacts that the military has had on Pleasanton and Livermore and Dublin and San Ramon. And it's all there. It's self-guided, so you can walk through at your own leisure and learn a lot more than you've already learned today about Camp Parks. And that's it for me, except for the one takeaway. I've given you a lot of information, but this is the one thing I'd like you to take away. This is the real short story of Camp Parks. It was the naval base with no docks, the Air Force base without a paved runway, and an Army base named after a Navy admiral. Thanks for listening. Take care. And if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer.
I like the last slide. That's fun.
It's,
So if I'm doing the math right, Steve, 20 to 30,000 people at Camp Parks, 20,000 people at Camp Shoemaker, and another 10,000 at the hospital site. And the two biggest towns around are Livermore and Dublin that have about 1,500 people each. What was the impact of this major center on local life at that time?
It was a huge impact. And it started all the way from the construction, all the way through the Navy days and the Air Force days, all the way into the Army days. And it was an impact not just on Dublin, Pleasanton, and Livermore, but it was a huge impact on Contra Costa County too. So the first impact is you've got probably several thousand construction people coming in 1942 to build these huge bases, 42 and 43. And they're in right away, there's a housing crisis in the communities. So you've got these 4,000 or 5,000 construction people, and where are you going to house them? It got to the point where there were people in Livermore and Pleasanton renting out their garages to the construction people. And then it just got worse. In fact, even as far away as Danville and Diablo, they were renting out facilities at the golf course to be used by people who first constructed Camp Parks and then later worked there. Because there's not just the Navy folks, there's a bunch of civilians who work at these places too. In addition to the housing crisis, it's a windfall for all the farmers because suddenly there's a place that wants all the food that they can grow, and they would buy it locally, and it doesn't have to be shipped very far and gets consumed locally. The other aspect is um, at Camp Parks, I think if I've got this right, you have to remember that every month about $1 million in salary is being given out to these 30,000 just at Camp Parks. So that money has to go somewhere. A lot of it goes home, a lot of it gets saved, but a lot of it will be used when they go to downtown Pleasanton or downtown Livermore, usually on alcoholic beverages and food. Dublin, not so much, because Dublin at this point's only got about 200 people and they're mainly in farms. But even the local farmers found an opportunity to sell excess eggs. They would go down and offer eggs to people hitchhiking on the side of the road who are all the Navy folks. So it's a huge economic impact all the way through to today, because those people who come to stay at Camp Parks and work on weekends and during the summer actually like to spend money and go to restaurants because it's usually better than what you can find on base.
We were chatting the other day, and you talked about convoys and the impact that they had on traffic. Can you talk about that too?
One thing to remember is that these are bases, and the bases usually have outlying activities. So one of the famous things for the Seabees is they would get together as a battalion of 1,000 guys, come together at Camp Parks, learn how to work together, and then they would have an exercise before they could deploy. And that exercise was to march from Dublin, usually on Doherty Road, or sometimes on Tassajara Road, to Mount Diablo, where they would do war games on Mount Diablo for several days. So the marching, remember, these are 30, 40, 50-year-old folks that are not necessarily too well trained to march. So this crowd of construction guys walking to Mount Diablo must have been very interesting, as well as all the supplies, or when you would move a battalion to go to deployment to Treasure Island, the truck convoys would be amazing. And it would tie up roads like on Highway 21, which we now know is basically San Ramon Road. There were times farmers couldn't leave their farms for an hour or two because of the convoys going from, say, Camp Parks to Camp Stoneman or over to Treasure Island. So there was a huge, huge impact on transportation, as well as it must have been amazingly fun for the kids to watch all these guys amble by on the way going someplace.
Couple of things that we've been asked, and this is two questions that are related to each other. Wesley wanted to know precisely where was Camp Shoemaker, and the reason was his father was discharged from there in May of 1946.
So Shoemaker is basically between Arnold Road and Tassajara Creek, and from Highway 580 all the way to the county line in Contra Costa and a little bit farther. So Hacienda Theaters, that's the middle of Camp Shoemaker. If you think about, let's see, Zeiss Corporation, that's, Camp Shoemaker. If you think about the current Santa Rita Jail, that's also on Camp Shoemaker. And it's interesting that you bring it up. I'm not surprised at all that the discharge papers say Shoemaker on it. There's a really, really good chance that anybody who served in the Navy in the Pacific and who got out had to go through Shoemaker. And as I mentioned earlier, between about August of 1945 and all the way through 1946, Shoemaker was discharging people, 1,000 people a day. So that's 30,000 a month. And then you multiply that by about 10 months. That's a lot of people. And it's also kind of fun because as we look at these old discharge papers, I hear many, many, many times people go, where the hell was Shoemaker? How come I can't find it? One of the reasons we don't call this area Shoemaker anymore is because at the end of 1946, the Navy said, hey, Dublin, Pleasanton, Livermore. We will leave the post office facilities that we have here that we're handling 90,000 people. And you can, use this post office, which is called Shoemaker, as long as you want. And then someone in the post office realized that there already was a Shoemaker, California. And that Shoemaker, California is down south, and it had existed before the war. So that's why Shoemaker really disappears at that time.
So talk about name confusions. Arnold Drive, which I gather had several other names and maybe some inter-service rivalry attached to it.
So one of the things to consider is that when they're building these bases, someone is sitting around going, oh, like, we're going to have all these streets. We've got to name these streets. And one aspect of Camp Parks today is if you look at the base, there's still a first, second, third, fourth, and fifth streets. And those names go all the way back to World War II, to the actual construction of Camp Parks. The north-south roads, however, the north-south roads were named by the Navy after admirals. When the Air Force came in, they said, oh, no, we don't want any of this Navy shit. They're going to say, we're going to name all these admiral names and change them to Air Force general names. And the one surviving one is Arnold Road. It's named after Hap Arnold, who was one of the founders of the Air Force. I pointed out to the Army about 10 years ago that I said, everyone else has changed all the names. When are you guys going to get around to changing the names? And they said, that's a really good point. So many of the north-south roads that are in Camp Parks nowadays are beginning to represent modern day things and Army things.
So alternative uses for Camp Parks. We have somebody that, Molly, who came in talking about playing volleyball at probably the drill hall, I guess. Mm-hmm. And a son that plays Babe Ruth baseball at Camp Parks.
Oh yeah, the baseball field at Camp Parks has been in use by local communities, gosh, all the way back to a long, long time ago. And it was one of those early situations where when Dublin was getting built up back in the 60s, where there was nothing and there were no parks, there were really no even schools, local parents really wanted to have, a baseball set of activities. So they partnered with Camp Parks to use a facility that was not being used at that time. And that opportunity to share went on it's still going on today. And I think that's one of the longest community Camp Parks relationships that's been there.
Abby had a question for you as far as, is there any way to track a relative? Her uncle was a CB from Nevada that apparently went through Parks.
So there's a lot of stuff online. If you know what unit he was in, that really, really helps. But what I would suggest is send me an email, or we'll figure out how to do that. And I can help you because I've done that with lots and lots of families. Usually it helps if you've got any records that they had that they gave you. Sometimes you can recreate a little bit of their service history. Sometimes you can't. If I know what battalion it is, I can tell you probably when the battalion was at Camp Parks. But sometimes the CB Museum in Southern California will have information. But they usually before they engage with you, you have to give them as much as you can possibly give to differentiate. Remember that there were over 100,000 CBs during World War II. And they went in lots of different places. If you go to our museum, the Dublin Camp Parks Military History Center, we have a map up on the wall that shows where all the CB units that went through Camp Park actually served in the Pacific. It's pretty impressive.
Was there any Nike anti-aircraft radar training done there? Or the question really revolves around a sort of mid-50s, a dad was in the Army, and it's thought that he trained on Nike anti-aircraft radar. Does that make sense for Camp Parks, or is that maybe one of the Nike sites that are also around here?
Yes. And I know that doesn't answer the question.
Okay.
So here's kind of an answer. So early on in the U.S. military, 1946 and 1947, as the U.S. Air Force is put together, the U.S. Air Force and the U.S. Army have to decide who gets to do what. And all through World War II, the Army always took care of defending Air Force bases wherever they were. The Air Force took over that responsibility about defending bases. So what happened is, for a little while, there would be Army people deployed to Air Force bases to train people into how to defend the bases, to get the skill set. At the same time, there's this transition, this fight basically between the Air Force and the Army. Who gets to defend against enemy bombers? And that's where you have the Nike and Ajax missile systems developed. And eventually that transition where Nike Ajax is run by the Army for quite some time, but it really helps the Air Force do their mission, which is defeating enemy bombers. So yes, at Camp Parks, there were Army people who were training Air Force people, and there was also a unit that taught skills necessary, not just for defending air bases, but for defending anti-aircraft missile bases. And they were actually on site. And in one of the kind of very, very odd kind of hidden things about what goes on in the Cold War Bay Area, there was a unit at Camp Parks that was training how to protect the nuclear weapons that were at the Nike Ajax sites all around the Bay Area. And not a lot of people realize that there were nuclear weapons at those sites.
Okay. This kind of relates to your last slide about no paved runway and being an Air Force base. What were the recruits being trained for? Is this basic training? Okay.
This is how
and not flight training.
No, it's not flight training. And you got to remember, in the Air Force, the vast majority of people are not pilots, even though all we ever hear about in the Air Force is pilots. So most of the people that really make the Air Force work and make the planes run, this is where they first learn how to be Air Force people. So it's all basic training, and immediately after basic training, they go on to technical school. So they would learn how to run radar, or to operate trucks or cars, do administrative activities, go on to intelligence activities or air security or air police activities. That would all happen someplace else. At the same time, at Parks Air Force Base, there were other units later, like in 58 and 59, that helped move Air Force personnel that were trained from the US off to the Pacific and bringing them back.
Okay. You've been thanked by a lot of people for the presentation, and
Thank you.
One of them came in as she has some material that you may be interested in for the hospital staff, hospital nursing staff from World War II. So I'll send that on to you once we're done.
Yeah, if anybody has any questions, send them off to your museum, to you, and then send them to me whenever you get around to it.
Okay.
I do want to mention one thing about the hospital that I didn't mention. So it's a Navy hospital from 43 to 46. And then when the Air Force comes back, they reopen the hospital. And it becomes an Air Force hospital to take care of all the recruits and everybody else. So there's a whole new set of military people in the Air Force, doctors and everybody else, who wind up being at that hospital. And it's also important to realize that that hospital has an impact on the community. Even during World War II, there were Livermore and Pleasanton babies delivered at that hospital.
It makes sense, sure.
In the 60s, or as long as it's up until 59, there were Pleasanton, Livermore babies born at the Air Force Hospital.
Got it. You use what you got, huh?
Yeah, yeah.
That's it for questions, Steve. Thank you for your presentation. And I'd like to thank everyone who viewed this presentation this morning. If you missed any of our earlier programs, you can find them by visiting the museum's website at museumsrv.org. Today's program will appear early next week. Our next program will be Thursday, April the 15th at 11:30. We have all heard of John Muir. We know that he's a conservationist and helped to preserve Yosemite, and maybe some of us visited his home in Martinez. But John Muir, the inventor, world traveler, and what about the University of Wisconsin? Garrett Daly, noted authority on John Muir, will answer those questions and more. So we hope to have you tune in on Thursday, Tax Day, April 15th. If you like these programs and wish them to continue, we ask that you make a donation by going to the museum's webpage, museumsrv.org, and clicking on the Donate Now button. Somebody did ask if we were reopening. We are reopening tomorrow, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. Our model trains will be back for a month. So please go to the museum website and check for days and hours of that we're open. Now that we're reopening, we're also in need of volunteers. If you can give us some time, please contact the museum. We hope you enjoyed today's presentation. Stay safe, and thank you for watching.